The Grand Orient de France, founded in 1773, is the oldest and largest Masonic body in continental Europe. It distinguished itself by rejecting the obligation of belief in a supreme being, which separated it from the Anglo-Saxon model of Freemasonry. During the 19th century, it became deeply entwined with French republicanism, anti-clerical politics, and secular education reforms, making it both influential and controversial. When Marshal Philippe Pétain established the Vichy regime in 1940, Freemasonry was explicitly targeted as a subversive, anti-Catholic, and anti-state force. Vichy authorities banned all Masonic lodges, seized their meeting places, confiscated archives, and published membership lists to stigmatize affiliates. This persecution was aligned with Nazi anti-Masonic ideology, which associated Masonry with liberalism, Jewish influence, and resistance networks. Many members of the Grand Orient were arrested, imprisoned, or executed, while others joined the French resistance. The suppression nearly destroyed its organizational structure, but after the liberation of France in 1944, the Grand Orient resumed activity, rebuilt its lodges, and reasserted its place as a leading force in European Freemasonry. The United Grand Lodge of England, UGLE, established in 1717, is considered the mother lodge of modern Freemasonry. Within England itself, it was never formally banned, even during World War II, but its members and overseas branches were directly affected by Nazi expansion across Europe. Adolf Hitler's regime identified Freemasonry as a hostile organization tied to liberal democracy, international finance, and alleged Jewish conspiracies. As German forces occupied territories across Europe, Masonic lodges connected to or recognized by the UGLE were dismantled, their properties confiscated, and records seized. Nazi propaganda exhibitions, such as the 1937 anti-Masonic exhibition in Munich, displayed artifacts taken from English-affiliated lodges, portraying them as enemies of the Reich. Members who were identified as Freemasons risked imprisonment, forced labor, or deportation to concentration camps, where wearing the red triangle or other identifying insignia marked them for persecution. While the central UGLE in London survived the war intact, its European branches suffered devastating losses, and its members abroad faced severe repression until Allied victory restored their freedom to meet. The Grand Lodge of Austria, officially founded in 1914, represented a continuation of Masonic traditions that had existed in the region since the 18th century. Austrian Freemasonry developed a distinct cultural identity, influenced by Central European intellectual and artistic circles. However, when Adolf Hitler annexed Austria in the 1938 Anschluss, the Nazis quickly outlawed Freemasonry. They regarded it as part of an international conspiracy alongside Jews and liberal politicians. The Grand Lodge of Austria was dissolved, its properties and temples confiscated, and its archives seized for use in Nazi propaganda. Members of the fraternity were investigated, harassed, and many faced imprisonment or exile. Masonic artifacts from Austria were displayed in anti-Masonic exhibitions organized by the Reich to demonstrate alleged secret threats against the German people. The repression destroyed most of the organizational structure of Austrian Masonry. After World War II in 1952, the Grand Lodge of Austria was formally reconstituted, rebuilding from scattered survivors and restoring its lodges in Vienna and beyond. Germany had multiple Masonic obediences before the rise of Adolf Hitler, including the Grand Lodge of Prussia, known as the Three Globes, and other regional Grand Lodges that traced their origins to the early 18th century. Collectively, German Freemasonry was diverse, with some lodges more aristocratic and Christian-oriented, while others were liberal and cosmopolitan. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, all forms of Freemasonry were declared incompatible with National Socialist ideology. Hitler and his propagandists labeled lodges as part of a Jewish Masonic conspiracy, tying them to communism, liberalism, and international finance. The German Grand Lodges attempted various survival strategies. Some tried to distance themselves from liberal Masonry by emphasizing Christian values and nationalism, but these concessions failed. By 1935, the Nazi government ordered the complete dissolution of Freemasonry in Germany. Lodge properties were seized, archives were confiscated, and artifacts were displayed in anti-Masonic exhibitions to indoctrinate the public. Many members were monitored by the Gestapo, with some arrested and sent to concentration camps, where they were marked with red triangles as political prisoners. The once strong Masonic presence in Germany was effectively wiped out until after World War II, when surviving brothers rebuilt under Allied protection. Freemasonry in Spain dates back to the 18th century, and by the early 20th century, the Grand Lodge of Spain and the Grand Orient of Spain were active, often linked to liberal, republican, and secular movements. This association made Spanish Masonry a target during the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. General Francisco Franco, a staunch Catholic nationalist, identified Freemasons alongside communists as enemies of his regime. In 1940, he enacted the Law for the Repression of Masonry and Communism, which made membership in a lodge a criminal offense. Masonic temples were confiscated or destroyed, and archives were seized to identify members. Thousands of Freemasons were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Franco himself frequently blamed Freemasonry in his speeches, presenting it as part of a global conspiracy undermining Spain's Catholic and nationalist identity. The persecution drove the Grand Lodge underground, forcing surviving brothers into secrecy or exile, with many continuing their activities abroad in Latin America and France. Freemasonry in Spain remained banned throughout Franco's dictatorship, lasting until his death in 1975. Only in 1979, after Spain's democratic transition, was the Grand Lodge of Spain officially re-established, marking the return of open Masonic activity after 4 decades of suppression. Hungarian Freemasonry developed strongly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with the Grand Lodge of Hungary established in 1886. Lodges were active in Budapest and other major cities, often tied to intellectual, liberal, and reformist circles. However, Freemasonry's influence was viewed with suspicion by authoritarian regimes that rose during the 20th century. The first blow came in 1920, after Hungary's short-lived Soviet Republic. The new government imposed restrictions, and by the late 1930s, right-wing nationalist forces were openly hostile to Masonic organizations. After World War II, when Hungary fell under Soviet control, Freemasonry was completely outlawed. In 1950, the communist regime banned the Grand Lodge of Hungary, labeling it a bourgeois and subversive society incompatible with socialist ideology. Lodge properties were seized, and members faced pressure, surveillance, and persecution. For decades, Hungarian Freemasonry survived only in exile, particularly in Western Europe and the United States. It was not until the collapse of communist rule in 1989 that the Grand Lodge of Hungary was reconstituted. Today, it operates openly again, but its legacy still carries the memory of decades of suppression under totalitarian regimes. Freemasonry in Cuba has deep roots, with the Grand Lodge of Cuba officially founded in 1859. Unlike in many Latin American nations, Cuban Masonry became extremely influential, counting intellectuals, politicians, and even independence leaders like José Martí among its supporters. By the mid-20th century, the fraternity was well established with thousands of members across the island. The turning point came with Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution. At first, Freemasonry was not completely outlawed, since the government distinguished it from openly religious institutions, but it was treated with suspicion. The new Marxist-Leninist regime considered lodges centers of bourgeois influence and potential opposition. Masonic leaders faced harassment, surveillance, and infiltration by state security. Many lodges lost property and funding as the government nationalized assets. Members who openly opposed the revolution risked imprisonment or exile, and a large portion of the fraternity's strength shifted abroad, especially to the United States, where Cuban Freemasons in exile kept the tradition alive. Although the Grand Lodge of Cuba still exists today and was never fully dissolved, it has operated under strict state control since the 1960s. Its autonomy and influence have been heavily reduced compared to its pre-revolutionary prominence, making it one of the most monitored Masonic bodies in the world. Freemasonry in Russia had existed since the 18th century, with lodges attracting intellectuals, nobles, and reform-minded elites. The movement gained strength during the Enlightenment, but was repeatedly suppressed by czars who feared its liberal and cosmopolitan influence. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the situation worsened dramatically. The Bolsheviks regarded Freemasonry as a bourgeois and counter-revolutionary organization tied to Western powers and capitalist elites. By the early 1920s, Masonic activity was banned outright under Soviet law. Lodges were dismantled, properties confiscated, and members forced into secrecy or exile. Many Freemasons fled abroad, continuing their work in Paris, London, and New York, while others within the USSR faced persecution, imprisonment, or execution under Stalin's purges. For nearly 7 decades, no official Masonic presence existed in Soviet territory. It was only after the collapse of the USSR in 1991 that the Grand Lodge of Russia was formally re-established, reconnecting with international Masonic bodies. However, its long absence meant that Russian Freemasonry had to rebuild from almost nothing, carrying the memory of one of the longest and most complete bands in Masonic history. Freemasonry in the Ottoman Empire had a long but precarious history, often tied to reformist and nationalist movements. After the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, the Grand Lodge of Turkey emerged as a continuation of this tradition. However, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's government, while modernizing and secular, viewed Freemasonry with suspicion, partly because of its links to political opposition groups and perceived foreign influence. In 1935, the Turkish government officially banned Masonic lodges, dissolving the Grand Lodge and confiscating property. This suppression lasted until 1948, when Turkey's gradual liberalization allowed the Grand Lodge to reconstitute. Yet political instability continued to threaten it. During the military coups of the 1960s and 1970s, Freemasonry again came under scrutiny, with lodges forced into secrecy or temporarily suspended. Anti-Masonic propaganda in Turkey frequently tied the fraternity to Zionism, Western imperialism, or hidden political agendas, fueling public hostility. Despite these repeated waves of suppression, Turkish Freemasonry managed to survive. Today, the Grand Lodge of Turkey exists openly, but its history remains marked by cycles of bans, persecution, and revival under changing regimes. Polish Freemasonry flourished in the 18th and 19th centuries, often tied to intellectual and independence movements during a time when Poland was partitioned by neighboring empires. The Grand Lodge of Poland was formally active by the early 20th century, but its survival was short-lived. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Freemasonry was immediately outlawed. Lodges were closed, archives seized, and many Polish Freemasons were imprisoned or executed in concentration camps. The Nazis portrayed Masonry as a branch of the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, making it a direct enemy of the Reich. After World War II, Poland fell under Soviet influence, and the communist regime maintained the ban. In 1947, the new authorities officially dissolved the Grand Lodge of Poland, branding it a reactionary and bourgeois organization. For decades, Masonic activity was forced underground or into exile, with Polish lodges operating abroad in France and the UK. It was not until the fall of communism in 1991 that the Grand Lodge of Poland was re-established inside the country. Today it operates legally again, but its legacy reflects a history of double persecution, first by the Nazis, then by the Soviets. The Grand Lodge of Czechoslovakia was founded in 1923, shortly after the nation itself was created following World War I. From the beginning, Czech and Slovak Freemasonry leaned toward liberal, democratic, and intellectual ideals, attracting politicians, artists, and reformers. This made it a target for authoritarian regimes on both ends of the political spectrum. When Nazi Germany occupied Czechoslovakia in 1939, the Grand Lodge was banned, lodges were dissolved, and Masonic property was confiscated. Members were persecuted, with many arrested or deported to concentration camps. Nazi propaganda portrayed Czechoslovak Freemasonry as part of an international Jewish conspiracy threatening the Reich. After the war, the fraternity briefly resurfaced, but by 1951, the new communist regime suppressed it again. Authorities labeled Freemasonry a bourgeois and reactionary society incompatible with socialist ideology. Lodges were shut down, and members faced harassment, surveillance, or exile. For nearly 4 decades, Freemasonry in Czechoslovakia was forced underground. It was only after the Velvet Revolution in 1989 that the Grand Lodge of Czechoslovakia was restored. In 1993, following the peaceful split of the country, separate Masonic bodies were reconstituted in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, reviving a tradition nearly destroyed by totalitarian regimes. Freemasonry in Romania gained strength in the 18th and 19th centuries, often tied to intellectual elites and national independence movements. By the early 20th century, the Grand Lodge of Romania was established and active, playing a role in cultural and political life. However, its liberal and democratic values soon placed it in conflict with authoritarian powers. During World War II, under the pro-Axis dictatorship of Ion Antonescu, Freemasonry was already under pressure. but its greatest persecution came after the Soviet occupation and the communist takeover in 1947. The new regime branded Masonry as a bourgeois conspiracy aligned with Western imperialism. In 1948, the Grand Lodge of Romania was formally banned. Lodge buildings were seized, archives confiscated, and members placed under surveillance or imprisoned. For over 4 decades, Romanian Freemasonry existed only in exile, with many continuing their activities abroad, particularly in France and Italy. Following the fall of Nicolae Ceausescu in 1989, Freemasonry was revived. The Grand Lodge of Romania was reconstituted, regaining official recognition and rebuilding its institutions. Today it operates legally once again, but its history remains defined by decades of forced silence under communist rule. Freemasonry in Greece dates back to the late 18th century, with lodges founded in the Ionian Islands and later spreading to the mainland. By the 20th century, the Grand Lodge of Greece was firmly established and maintained international recognition. However, its liberal and democratic character often put it at odds with authoritarian rulers. The most significant persecution occurred during the regime of the Colonels, 1967 to 1974, when a right-wing military junta seized power. The dictatorship considered Freemasonry a suspicious and potentially subversive organization tied to foreign influence and liberal politics. In 1967, the junta banned Masonic activity, dissolved lodges, and confiscated properties. Members were subjected to surveillance, harassment, and pressure to renounce their affiliation. Although the Grand Lodge of Greece survived symbolically through its networks abroad, within the country it was forced into silence for the duration of the dictatorship. Only after the restoration of democracy in 1974 was Freemasonry openly revived. Today, the Grand Lodge of Greece operates legally again, but its history reflects how authoritarian regimes, whether far-right or far-left, consistently treated Masonry as a threat to state power. Freemasonry in Bulgaria took root in the late 19th century, after the country gained independence from Ottoman rule. Intellectuals, reformers, and political figures joined lodges, which became associated with modernization and liberal ideals. The Grand Lodge of Bulgaria was formally established in 1917, and by the interwar period, it was active and connected with international Masonry. However, when Bulgaria came under communist control after World War II, Freemasonry was quickly outlawed. In 1940, the regime had already begun restricting secret societies, but by 1947 to 1948, the communist authorities dissolved the Grand Lodge completely. Masons were accused of serving bourgeois and imperialist interests, and the fraternity was labeled a threat to socialist ideology. Lodge buildings were confiscated, archives destroyed, and members subjected to surveillance, harassment, and imprisonment. For decades, Bulgarian Freemasonry survived only in exile, particularly in Western Europe. It was only after the fall of communism in 1989 that the Grand Lodge of Bulgaria was reconstituted, reconnecting with its international counterparts. Today, it operates legally once again, but the long suppression left deep gaps in its continuity, making it one of the many Eastern European Masonic bodies that had to rebuild from near extinction. Freemasonry in the Balkans developed unevenly, but by the early 20th century, the Grand Lodge of Yugoslavia had been formed, uniting lodges across the newly created Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia. Lodges attracted intellectuals, professionals, and reformist politicians, often aligning with liberal and democratic causes. After World War II, when Josip Broz Tito established the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Freemasonry was outlawed. The communist regime regarded it as a bourgeois secret society with ties to Western powers, incompatible with socialist ideology. By 1946 to 1947, the Grand Lodge of Yugoslavia was dissolved, its lodges shut down, and its archives and buildings confiscated. Members were monitored by state security services, and many were pressured into silence or forced into exile. For decades, there was no official Masonic presence in Yugoslavia. It was only after the breakup of the Federation in the 1990s that Freemasonry began to re-emerge in the successor states. Separate Grand Lodges were reconstituted in Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, and other republics, rebuilding from scratch after nearly 50 years of suppression. The Grand Lodge of Yugoslavia itself remained defunct, but its legacy continues in the restored national obediences across the region.